Hi, and welcome back to Info 3370, studying social inequality with data science. Today is a little different. So I'm a sociologist. I'm not a philosophy PhD. But many of us go through college and take technical courses all the way through and never get a chance to discuss big moral questions like those that arise in political philosophy. So in this data science course about inequality, we're going to take a brief detour here to just discuss some of the big principles in Rawls' notion of justice as fairness. And if you want the full reference, these come from A Theory of Justice, which is a landmark book by John Rawls. So our learning goals for today are that you'll be able to explain some of Rawls' key ideas: the original position, the equality principle, and the difference principle. So what is justice? If we think broadly, there are many conceptions of justice that exist in the world. You might think of justice as getting what you deserve. You might think of justice as some sort of fair distribution so that everyone has what they need. You might think of justice as wrongs that have been righted. So when we use justice, we throw it around in lots of informal ways. Today we're going to talk about formalizing justice in the Rawls sense. So to build into this, I want us to first consider a hypothetical American businessman. And this businessman says to you, I have a lot of money. In America, I get to keep that money, whereas in Sweden, I'd pay really high taxes. Therefore, I think America is more just. So let's pause and ask ourselves, what makes it hard to take the businessman's view as an objective assessment of the justice of society? So if you think about it, Rawls, I think, would point to one particular issue here in his argument, which is that he's appealed to his own position when making an argument about which society he would prefer. So because this businessman has a lot of money, he prefers America, where he gets to keep that money. Whereas if he somehow was not a businessman and was living in poverty and having trouble finding a job, he might prefer living in Sweden, where there's better social support for people in that situation. And so broadly, we would think that if we want to agree about what a just society should be, in our arguments we cannot appeal to our own place within that society. So we should evaluate the justice of a society as a whole without thinking about who we happen to be within that society. And so on this point, Rawls has some ideas about how we ought to choose principles for a just society. In particular, he argues that we should choose those principles from what he calls an original position. That's one in which no one knows his place in society, his position or social status, his fortune in the distribution of natural assets and abilities, his intelligence, strength, and the like. And I should pause and say, obviously Rawls was writing in a different era where he used these he, his pronouns all the time. What he means is no person knows their place in society. And so this is nice because this allows us to think about what makes a society just, separately from who we are in that society. And it's a purely hypothetical exercise, but it yields some useful conclusions. So we could think about what principles for society would we choose if we were placed in this position. In particular, you could think, would we allow slavery? Would we require complete equality? And if you don't know who you're going to be in society, let's take the slavery one, you probably wouldn't want to enter into a society that allows slavery because you might be the slave in that society. And so this is the power of Rawls' thought experiment, that we get to think about what kind of society we want, not knowing who we'd be in that society. So from the original position, Rawls thinks that we would collectively choose two principles of justice, which I'll refer to as the equality principle and the difference principle. So the equality principle says that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. And this is the principle that requires that we can't have slavery in society, because we want to ensure that before we enter into that society, we know that we will have equality of liberty. The second principle is the difference principle. So Rawls asks us to suppose that some people are born into a property-owning entrepreneurial class, and suppose that some others are born into a class of unskilled laborers. And you might think that we would want to choose a society where all incomes are completely equal. But Rawls asks the question, here set 1 has better economic prospects, and for justice, do we need to make their two outcomes equal? Or is there any way that a society where there is some amount of inequality could be considered just? And Rawls comes to the conclusion that we could defend, on principles of justice, the notion of some inequality if it's to the advantage of those who are at the bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy. So if giving slightly higher incomes to that property-owning entrepreneurial class actually raises the well-being of the unskilled laborers by making things more efficient or promoting innovation, things like that, then perhaps we could have some amount of inequality. So Rawls is not advocating for pure equality here, but he's advocating for a default to equality, and we can only diverge from equality to the degree that it helps those who are worst off. Specifically, he says that social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both reasonably expected to be to everyone's advantage and also attached to positions and offices open to all. So briefly, how does this depart from other conceptions of justice? Rawls has a section where he discusses some other ways we might think about justice and how his proposal is better than those other ideas. So one might think that a just society is one characterized by natural liberty. Quote, a basic structure satisfying the principle of efficiency and in which positions are open to those able and willing to strive for them, that will lead to a just distribution. This is kind of similar to what a lot of Americans think, which is that we should just have a free market society where those who are able to will work perhaps harder or do things that lead to higher pay, and we should be fine with that because everyone who's able is able to earn whatever they can. So now consider a hypothetical. Suppose it pays really well to lift sandbags up a hill. Suppose that Sarah and Frank are both really strong, so they're really able to lift these sandbags. But before hiring people to lift the sandbags up a hill, we flip a coin, and Sarah loses the coin toss, so she's prohibited from applying to this job lifting the sandbags. So, as a result, Sarah lives in poverty, and Frank is wealthy. Is this a just allocation? And when we look at that, something about it seems unjust. In particular, there's this random chance of the coin flip, which has resulted in different outcomes for Sarah and Frank, despite the fact that they both are able to lift the sandbags and they are willing to strive for lifting those sandbags up the hill. Now let's take a different turn on it. So suppose instead of a coin flip, this society simply has a rule. Only men are allowed to lift the sandbags. And similarly, in this hypothetical, most people will say, oh no, that seems very unjust, because Sarah here is strong, she's able to lift the sandbags, but she's prohibited unjustly from participating in that society. So Rawls argues that social circumstances and such chance contingencies as accident and good fortune, these things are arbitrary from a moral point of view. There's no moral sense in which Frank should have more money than Sarah should in either of these situations, because the differences in their outcomes are by these arbitrary things that shouldn't matter for who deserves to have more money. So then Rawls takes it a step further. Suppose we move from natural liberty to liberal equality. Here he adds fair equality of opportunity. Those with similar abilities and skills should have similar life chances. So here Sarah and Frank, they should have the same life chances in this society. But now let me change the hypothetical a little bit. Suppose it pays really well to lift sandbags up a hill. Suppose Frank is born weak. He's just predisposed to never have the strength to lift those sandbags. Whereas Sarah is born with a predisposition to be really strong so that lifting the sandbags is easy for her. And as a result, Frank lives in poverty and Sarah is wealthy. So now we ask ourselves, is this fair? Is it fair that Frank is weak and thus lives in poverty and Sarah is strong and thus she's wealthy? And when you think about this, you realize that there is another kind of lottery going on here. There's a natural lottery for who has the abilities that lead them to higher pay. So Rawls emphasizes that both social and natural chance, they are both arbitrary. Quote, for once we are troubled by the influence of either social contingencies or natural chance on the determination of distributive shares, so that's like the coin flip prevents you from working, we are bound on reflection to be bothered by the influence of the other, because after all, it's effectively a coin flip that Sarah was lucky to be born as someone who's going to grow up and be strong, and Frank was unlucky to be born as someone who's not going to grow up and be strong. So Rawls writes, from a moral standpoint, the two seem to be equally arbitrary. So if this is arbitrary, can we ever justify inequality? Rawls argues that the higher expectations of those better situated are just if and only if they work as part of a scheme which improves the expectations of the least advantaged members of society. So Rawls recognizes that once people are born, they are going to be different. And he argues that the only reason to justify some amount of inequality is if it lifts the prospects of those at the bottom. Because after all, from the original position, you don't know if you might be that person at the bottom. So to recap, Rawls has this original position, which he argues defines a scenario under which there's a procedure that will result in the choice of principles of justice. And he says that fair procedure would result in the choice of two principles, equality of liberty and the difference principle. And I think this is a great point for us to discuss of is this justice? Notably, this is justice in the sense that we all have equal liberty. And it's justice in the sense that the distribution is arranged such that those at the bottom are well off. But it is very different from many common conceptions of justice, in that there's no sense in which those with greater abilities or greater work deserve any higher position in the socioeconomic hierarchy. Rather, justice here is defined by a procedure that helps us understand what kind of society would be just or not, where we don't know who we are going to be within that society. So that's our learning goals for today. Next class, we're going to talk about Robert Nozick and a perspective that really emphasizes individual property rights and is in many ways a response to Rawls' perspective.